Hey, this is Helen Dawson, and you're listening to the Innovation Crowd podcast. Businesses are looking to reinvent themselves, be more digital, more sustainable, and thrive in a volatile world. Yet most corporate innovation programs don't deliver. In fact, many don't even survive after their second birthday. On this show, I sit down with the experts to discuss the strategies that work, so you don't have to learn the hard way. So come and join me in the Innovation Crowd. So welcome back to the Innovation Crowd. We've talked a lot in the past about partnerships and about collaboration, and we really wanted to explore this further. So I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Blackley, who's my go-to person on advising companies on JVs and partnering, with an interest in how we do that these days with gaining sustainable growth. So welcome, Emma.
Thank you.
Give us a flavour of kind of some of the companies and the partnerships that you've been involved in.
Okay, well, I've been involved in a lot of cross-border partnerships, like with big companies like Raytheon, with their partnership on cybersecurity with Saudi Aramco. I think the more interesting ones for me and probably for your audience would be the slightly smaller ones where there's a partner that I'm working for instance, a relatively small SME size UK anti-drone company, which was trying to do a partnership with a very large French state-owned aerospace and defense company with multiple divisions and a lot of internal politics. I've worked for companies in between, US, UK, US, Europe, UK only, Europe only. And it's interesting that with the exception of some of the more nuanced cultural differences, as in sort of China, UK, India, UK, and funnily enough, US, UK, but we can talk about that if you wish. I think that typically what one comes up against, whether it's big, small, the issues tend to be the same or very similar, regardless of sector and size. Which is why having somebody like me who's sort of done multiple different such deals and helped people through those pitfalls, if a client comes to me, then, because I've seen it before, I can help them not to make those same old errors, shall we say, particularly in planning. So hopefully they can get it right first time.
And so what are those same old pitfalls and errors that people make?
Well, usually it's about planning or lack of it. I mean, it's quite extraordinary how often I find that people have done what I think of as a back of a fag packet calculation, what they think of as a very clever, very detailed financial spreadsheet with all sorts of whizzy things that tell them why they're going to grow because of the market share and the adjacencies and the synergies, hate that word, synergies that are going to result in a much more efficient or cost-effective way of doing things. What they tend to forget is that there's somebody, this is one party doing this, building this beautiful spreadsheet, having its great thoughts. What they tend to forget is that there's somebody else on the other side of the table who has an equal really share in whether the relationship and the business is a success or not, and that's regardless of structure. If it's a partnership, then both parties need to work together efficiently and effectively to deliver what they want to deliver. And if you don't know what's on the other side, if you don't know those people, you don't understand their business, and you don't know what they're aiming for, you are basing your entire spreadsheet and your entire business case on an overriding assumption that you are right about everything and that there is nothing unknown on the other side of the table. You might think I'm exaggerating. I'm slightly exaggerating to make the point, but I have, over the last 12 or 15 years when I've been doing this, been continually astonished by how little people think about the fact that there is an ongoing relationship with another party. And of course, they need to understand the goals of that party, the operational ins and outs, do's and don'ts, strengths and weaknesses of that party, before they start going into bat with deals and offers and money and valuations.
Why do you think it's sort of so much harder than at one end of the spectrum doing a procurement and on the other end of the spectrum sort of doing traditional M&A and investing in a company? Why do you think it's harder?
Well, I suppose I don't want to be unfair to those in procurement and M&A. I'm not saying that's easy, because it's not. And we know that a lot of the success or failure of such things about the integration piece at the end, or perhaps the sort of negotiation and the sort of getting it right after having a few goes at it on the procurement side. But the point is, there's one side which is basically in control, because you're either contracting with somebody and therefore they're your supplier, so they do ultimately have to do what you say or you nix the deal, or you are acquiring and therefore taking over, and therefore ultimately you are responsible for the integration, the policies, the IT, the ongoing management. The difference, therefore, is that if you're not careful, everything after a deal like a JV or a partnership continues to be a negotiation, because you have got people on the other side who are running a business on which to some extent, depending on the partnership, you depend. Their operations you depend on, and they are run by somebody who doesn't answer directly to you, and they have their own axe to grind, their own desires for the business, and both for their business and for whatever the joint business is. So you are not in control. That's the big difference.
It's a myth. The myth that people have control when they're doing their business case spreadsheet and failing to understand that they're not.
Exactly. And there's the failing to understand that they're not in control, and which is another big one, the failure to understand what they look like to the other party.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, companies are very unused, I would say, to holding up a mirror to themselves. They tend to believe, and this is particularly true of large companies, but not exclusively, that the way they do things is the best way, that they do things better than anybody else, and that of course they should make all the decisions, because of course, as whatever company, that's what they do. That they kind of drink the Kool-Aid and believe that that's what they're like. They find it really hard to see from the other side of the table. But if you can imagine, take my French state-owned company, for example, which is kind of one pole of the example, but nonetheless, they think anybody who they do a deal with is honoured to do a deal with them. They think they're doing them a favour, basically, because they are so huge and they have such reach. So why is it that they need this little company? Well, they need the little company because the little company is dynamic. It has a technology which is highly innovative. It can move at speed, which is something that large organizations really struggle with. And it's run in a truly entrepreneurial way, because it's run by somebody who actually owns it and makes all the decisions. All of those things make it really hard, really, really different from the company on the other side. And, I found it really hard to try to explain to the French company, particularly because I wasn't working for them, I was working for the other side, that my client didn't actually appreciate the bureaucracy. The fact that the French had 3 different divisions that they had to get squared off before this deal could be signed was the French company's problem, not my client's problem. My client had stated very clearly that they wanted a non-exclusive deal with defined terms in each domain. So it was really the French company's job to define, to come back and respond and to define the criteria for each of the domains. And we set it out fairly clearly. And what came back was what can I call it? A sort of gobbledygook of legalese and soup that didn't make any sense to my client. And it was quite difficult to keep him, my client who owned his own company, keep him focused on the deal, because he would have just bailed, I think, if I hadn't been in between to sort of broker between the two and sort of translate what he was saying into something they could just about understand. It was a great exercise in patience and perseverance, but it did work and it was a success. But the main problem that the big company had was it just couldn't see anything from a position that was different from its own. That's an exaggerated example of something that happens almost every time. It may be worth mentioning that it's also true that some of the smaller companies, some of the innovative companies, some of the companies that own this really exciting new technologies, they could sometimes underestimate the power of what they have. And I'm not saying it's a good idea to go in and throw your weight around. That is not a good idea. But it is a good idea to ask for example, if you're a small company, you're going to bat with a big one, it is a good idea to ask the big company to pitch to you rather than let them expect that you will pitch to them. Because if you let them pitch to you, two things: you imply that there's a market out there, that there might be competition, which is not a bad thing. And the other thing is that in pitching to you, they have to reveal some of their hand, some of what it is they're going to do, what it is they intend, what it is they see, and why it is they want to do a deal with you. And all of those things equip you as the smaller partner who probably doesn't know them all that well, to manage the process of negotiation from a position of some understanding rather than from a position of total ignorance, where you might pitch it completely wrong particularly in terms of what you ask for. I'm a great believer that if you don't ask, you don't get. And this is true in life, but it's also true in negotiation. And there's no harm in stating, I want a non-exclusive or an exclusive deal. I'm only doing it in this territory. I want to limit it to this period because I want to see how it goes. I mean, all of those things are sensible. You would probably do it normally, but smaller companies tend to forget that and behave as if they need to sort of kowtow to the larger company. It's odd, but it's just a sort of mentality, I think, that we are all subject to, but it's not necessary in this case.
Isn't it interesting that kind of the misunderstandings of a small company not understanding that a big company, has to set at its stall?
Yeah, and it's also interesting that the big company is not actually usually terribly good at doing that either. I don't know. You would think that there's competition for M&A, for good M&A assets, and that people have to pitch, but they very often don't include stuff about the business plan, what's in it for the other side, how they're going to work together, how decisions are going to be made. What happens if performance is higher, that is better than expected, or less good than expected. All of those things. You wouldn't necessarily expect all of that to be laid out in a pitch, but sort of indicators, guidance, so that you can explore that when you get to having a discussion. I would expect those things to be, broadly speaking, in a kind of initial offer, but often they're not, because people just think, well, we're whatever great big brand name, so obviously we're going to be the best, and obviously people are going to want to be acquired by us. Which and this is even more the case in a partnership. I think what the big companies really do underestimate is how frightened, or if not frightened is probably the wrong word, because I don't know very many frightened entrepreneurs, but how suspicious is probably a better word. Entrepreneurs are of being tied up in the red tape of large companies, and of large companies saying that they will do X, Y, and Z, and then not delivering on it, so that they've kind of tied themselves up in a knot for not very much. Now that can be avoided But this is where they need to be really clear and really quite punchy about what they need and what they don't need, what they want and what they don't want. In return for, they do need to give something, but they've obviously got something they're going to give. It's just, how is it going to work, and how are we going to know it's going to work? How regularly are we going to meet? Is there going to be a plan? What happens if the plan goes wrong? Those sorts of things I would expect to be schedules to any agreement. So there is, there's an outline of a process which is going to be ongoing with named individuals who are going to be involved. And if I would say to people, if things aren't going well, raise it at the first or second of those. If you're having quarterly reviews of forecasts, raise it the first or the second. Don't leave it for a year, because by that time people have just lost interest, and often in big companies somebody's moved on, the person who did the deal. Yeah. So raise it early, raise it strongly, point to the things that you had agreed that are not happening, and get it sorted out. Why not? Because it's in the interest of both parties for it to work. That's the point. A good partnership, joint venture, collaboration of any kind is about a win-win, where both parties have decided there is something to be gained, and if they work together properly, they will gain it. So if that's not happening, there's something wrong with the way it's been executed.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, because often people sort of get trapped into this thinking that there must be winners and losers, and there's sort of someone getting a better deal than someone else. But the reality is everybody needs to make money. That's how business works.
Yeah, no, exactly. And obviously if you get into I would be slightly unfair, but I do think there's a slight M&A mentality of winners and losers, which I've seen trying to play out in the case of equity JVs. It's less common in sort of collaboration and cooperation agreements. Those tend to be more the ones that get tied up in knots with lawyers, which is another issue. But the ones that get problematic during the negotiation and upfront are ones where, you've got somebody who's a corporate development person or equivalent, or an M&A advisor who's trying to score a point on behalf of their client, which is completely inappropriate in relation to the nature of the deal that is being done. And they think because they're putting money in as an equity investment into this JV, it entitles them to win points. The point is, they should be investing into a business which is also dependent on the other party, who is also bringing whatever it's bringing, maybe money, maybe just resources and technology, to the business. And it's about the success of the business, that JV, that joint business. The clue is in the name, the joint business. And they're, to think that you can win on that score is inappropriate, unhelpful, and likely to lead to, if not to no deal, then at least to conflict on a fairly continuous basis, because it's just not the way things are done.
And we've talked quite a lot from the point of view of I guess, what an entrepreneur or a startup should look at when working with a corporate.
Yeah.
If you were advising a corporate who wanted to start, driving more innovation through collaborating with startups or scale-ups, smaller companies.
Yeah.
What would you be advising them to get in place?
Well, I'd certainly be helping them to be aware in a more detailed way of the suspicion that surrounds big companies, because I think they are all aware, because they sort of gut instinct is that an entrepreneur is not going to want to do a deal with a corporate, But I think what they need to be aware of is how important it is to have the operational side working. So I would say, particularly, don't do your normal corporate development thing where you do the deal and then lob it over the fence and the integration people take over, because there won't be integration people, or there'll be a joint team presumably running this thing, or there'll be a need for your operational people who are doing things the way they normally do them to learn to do them in a collaborative way with the other side. So you can't not involve them early on. I think that's a big difference. That these types of deals, you really do have to go down slightly further into the nitty-gritty of how the operations are going to have to work. And I think that's usually fairly unfamiliar to corporates. And I think when you do that, one of the ways of doing that, as you work through, assuming that you've got a sort of, you've been through these are our goals, they seem to be aligned, these are the people seem to be aligned okay, the culture seems okay. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of who needs to do what to make this work. That's when I think it's really important to help, maybe to coach some of the people in your business, unless you've got people who've done collaboration successfully before. If they haven't, it's not fair just to sort of, parachute them in and expect them to learn. Well, I mean, you can expect them to learn on their feet, but it's a bit of a risky way of doing it. It's better to, I think, to help them to maybe to have some facilitated joint sessions where there's an independent somebody who makes sure that listening, that there's more ear than mouth on both sides actually, but I'm assuming that corporates would have a more standard way of operationalizing an acquisition, say. So that might be the way they think, and they need to kind of unlearn some of that. This is about exploring, understanding, building mutual understanding, and building mutual respect, and deliberately overcoming that suspicion, deliberately overcoming that, the big guys may think this is going to work, but I'm never going to be able to work with people who work in a corporate. You do need to just be sensitive to that, work through it, and work on stuff. Because if you're just talking about sort of vaporware and PowerPoint slides and Excel models, doesn't mean anything to your operational people. If you put them down and you say, here's how we run our supply chain, can you take us through how that differs from how you run yours? Or just for example, and let's discuss it. Let's see where the differences are, where the potential glitches might be. Let's see how we can overcome them. I mean, it doesn't really matter. In a way, it doesn't matter what it is. It's about working together on a challenge or an opportunity, because that's the creativity. That's what you're trying to encourage, particularly in innovative collaborations, which are about innovation. Obviously, you want to encourage problem solving and opportunity seizing to work jointly together. Because then, if you've got that, that's the beginning of a success, because you have a team that is working collaboratively to solve something or to create something. And from that, you then build that. In the process I would advise people to go through, I would say, do some of those workshops just as a part of getting to know you, and then start to capture some of that and turn it into your business plan. Because, your business plan is a joint business plan, but it needs to be owned by the appropriate people in the business who need to understand what is meant, so that you don't have what so often happens, which is a business plan in isolation from the operation team, which is then impossible to execute because certain questions haven't been answered, like how are decisions made, what policies are we following, whose technology are we using, etc., etc.
It's so interesting you say about that getting to that operational level, because I guess you've said in words something that I was kind of aware of, but not so much. And I think that's really interesting. A lot of these things happen at a very high level without actually involving the people that really know what happens on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that I think, to me, I mean, this is really why I got interested in this type of deal way back. It's because I grew up in my first career in a business where I was a P&L owner of a small P&L and a medium-sized P&L, then a big P&L. And as a P&L owner, you are the person who has to keep an eye on all the pieces. You have to be able to see the high level, the strategic level, but you also have to be able to dive down into the detail, because if you don't understand that, how can you manage the people? How can you take corrective action? So all of those skills that I developed, I hope some skills, but also experience that I developed over 10, 15 years in P&L roles of different sizes are exactly the skills that are needed to make these collaborations and joint ventures work. And it's very rare to find that combination of skills in an advisor, I think, because we so often grow up not just in the world of professional services, but in other places, of course, within corporates, within industry, in our silo. And it's really only when you get fairly high up in an organization that you have the accountability to look at everything and how it all fits together. So I think, to me, I mean, that's why I find it fascinating, but it's also why it's unfamiliar, I think. As a service to clients, this is an unfamiliar thing because they're used to, your change management or your supply chain or your finance, but to say in the nicest possible way, you're everything because you have to be, you're from strategy through operation to execution and exit, that's very unfamiliar. But it's not that I'm an expert in any of those things because I don't need to be. There are experts within each of the organizations. It's really hard to hold those things together. So what I'm doing is helping whoever is ultimately accountable on either side, who has to have that view, to be able to see not just how their own piece works, but how this joined up piece might work and where all the bodies might be buried, both now and in the future, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think, it's probably more important now than it's ever been because, technology changes quickly. People need more partnerships if they want to innovate, if they want to tackle some of these emerging challenges around climate change. You need to bring together a kind of mosaic of capabilities.
Yeah.
So you can't just build it yourself.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think the sort of the whole build, buy or partner question, it's always been there. But in the past, the partner one has been largely been dictated by capital intensity. Now, I think it's dictated by as much as anything by competitive pressures and the need for speed. And to some extent, regulation comes into that mix as well. And I think it's people know that, I think intellectually, but I think it requires a certain humility to realize that actually somebody else might be better at this particular piece of the puzzle than you. And then it requires different skills from those which we traditionally valued in business, to stitch those things together in a way that creates a happy partnership and successful sort of virtual learning cycle that everybody benefits from. Because we have most of us grown up in this sort of dog eat dog, you win, I win, you lose, rather, world. And you have to sort of unlearn some of those things in order to succeed in this new world.
You mentioned pace and speed. What are the things that kind of help people move at pace and what holds them back?
I think the thing that helps, funnily enough, I think the thing that helps people move at pace really is slowing down a bit at the beginning and developing a proper plan, which is really whether the why are we doing this and what are the absolute fundamentals of it is really well buttoned down up front. And then there's sort of sticking to that unless and until you bump into something which is so fundamental that you have to go back and revise. And then you don't tweak what you've done. You go back and properly revise it. So it's that kind of robust discipline up front, which I've found people are very resistant to because they feel you're holding them back. But the point is, doing your thinking and taking your stakeholders with you around that thinking up front means that when you get to actually doing the deal and making it happen, you don't have to do all of that on the fly because you've already done it, or you point people back to things that you've already decided that they have already okayed. And you say, we're just delivering on what you say. I mean, it's not quite as simple as that, but I think the most fundamental thing that creates delay actually is muddled thinking and lack of clarity. and lack of taking stakeholders with you. So that piece around what I think of as proper preparation, being able to answer the question, whoever asks it, why are we doing this? That's a fundamental that can cause delays. And I guess the other one is probably, then there are more obvious things like changes of personnel, which is often an issue with corporates, because, we haven't talked a lot about the importance of relationships as yet, but in this type of deal, it's really pretty important that you get those peer-to-peer relationships going and you sustain them, at least for the first, year, 2 years of the arrangement, whatever it is you're doing together. Because if there's too much churn, then it unpicks all this planning, and people that tend to sort of go back and revisit things because they want to score a point. And when it comes to relationships, people have built a relationship of trust and then it disappears. And that can be very, very damaging to the overall relationship between two parties. If it's a very important relationship and suddenly, for example, a corporate decides this is a high performer who now needs to move from here to over there, that can actually, I've seen that scupper the deal, because it just suggests that the partner company, parent company, doesn't value this relationship, this partnership enough to keep one of its high performers there. And it can be solved. Of course it can, by putting somebody good after it and spending enough time and massaging the egos and building the relationship and blah, blah, blah. But it can create a big hiccup.
Yeah, and I guess it's that thing, people move around all the time in corporate. It's very rare to find someone in a corporate that's been in their role for 5 years these days, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think there's sort of no consideration really around the external relationships that are affected by internal job moves.
No, exactly. I mean, I'd go a little bit further than that. I think there's until you actually point it out to people very specifically and with some really concrete examples, there's little value associated with relationships, period, actually. I might be overstating it, but that's been my observation. If you point it out, if you create an example, if you show people what you mean, then they say, "Oh yes, of course, well, absolutely." But they say, "Well, absolutely," but it's not what they would do in the circumstances, because they think first about the numbers, the hierarchy, the career, and so on, and secondly about the knock-on impacts on relationships, I think. And I think, to some extent, you're not going to change that. But I think if larger organizations are going to manage to succeed and build sustainable partnerships with this ecosystem of smaller, more innovative, faster moving companies, they absolutely have to get their heads around how to do that. And it is going to affect their moving people around sort of thing. I think they just need to be a little bit more flexible about that, a little bit more imaginative about it. And personally, I think the skills that you would learn as a high potential person from working very closely in a relationship of not perhaps a tiny one, but a strategically important collaboration. Why would that not be a fantastic training ground for a high potential senior person who's tipped for the top in the senior organization? Because I think this is not going to go away, this need to collaborate. It's going to, if anything, it's going to increase.
Yeah, and so often in these conversations, we end up background with we start off talking about structures or process or different approaches, and we end up with people. So many of these challenges are really challenges of people and relationships.
Absolutely.
I mean, perhaps the whole world of work is when it comes down to it.
Yes, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, of course. But it's very interesting to, I remember when I was working for an American company, for example, in the automotive industry, and there were regulatory reasons, I think they needed to do a joint venture in a particular subset of their business, and they had aborted something that they had tried to do a year or two ago because it was costing a fortune and going pear-shaped. So that when they came back to it again, it came to the top of the priority pile, and they decided to take some advice. And we went through an exercise. I went through an exercise of helping them to take the lessons learned from the last time, and also to establish, some of the building blocks of why they're doing it, what they need, who they are, what they might need to unlearn and do differently, all of those things. And one of the things that it turned out they'd done no work on at all was anything to do with culture. So I said, well, is this business going to be a mature business that just sort of ticks along and you just need people who will sort of obey the policies and the rules and keep it going? Or is this a business where there is some growth potential, but you actually need bright people who will be innovative and creative? Oh, well, of course, we need bright people who are innovative and creative. Oh, yes. Okay. So did you include that in your thinking about how to find a partner? And how are you going to assess that? Well, no, they obviously did a sort of paper exercise via their corporate development team. So I helped them to devise a process where when they got to the point of, I think they had 4 or 5 different companies, they actually went through an exercise of discussion of various scenarios and talking to the teams, which included the chief technology officer, the chief operating officer, and I think the chief people officer, plus the person who was leading the negotiation, about how they would respond. And, it's not rocket science. It's just about asking a few simple questions. You let people know you're going to do this. They have time to think about it. You don't it's not a trick. But it doesn't half separate the sheep from the goats. And coming out of that, there were clearly only 2 companies that it was possible for them to do a deal with, who sort of spoke the same language and got the point. And after that, it made it a lot easier because then you're negotiating, you're kind of, I suppose, playing one off against the other in a way, but you're also sure that you've got something, or as sure as you can be, that you've got a management team that you're going to be able to work with. But, that is common sense. That is just an obvious thing to do. But it is not an obvious thing to do in this context. And possibly that's a particular thing that is particularly true of US companies. I'm not sure, really. But certainly they are very odd about assuming that it's all done in a contract and that you don't have to worry about operational things or people, because if you've got it in the contract, it's all going to happen, isn't it? Because everybody obeys the contract. That is a particular trait I've found is very, very exaggerated in it's not exclusive, but it's very exaggerated in big US corporations.
How interesting. We all think we speak the same language and we're similar, but obviously we're not.
No, very much not, I would say. Yeah, when it comes to certain things, we're definitely not. The business is one of those, I think.
So to close out, Emma, let me ask you the question that I ask everybody on this. What's one lesson that you learnt the hard way that you wish someone had just tapped you on the shoulder and told you early on in your career?
I think probably don't put off something that you don't really want to do. This involves people, because you think you might be being unfair. I mean, I think for most people, instinct is fairly good guide as to whether you are actually, somebody is telling you the truth, doing a good job, going to pull their finger out and do what they say they're going to do. And I when I was running probably the largest of the P&Ls I was talking about earlier, I had a US sales director who, something about her, she was a bright thing, but something about her made me feel uncomfortable, that I wasn't sure that I was being told the full getting the full picture, or that she listened to anything that I said. She was one of those people who waited to speak rather than listening. But I let that situation carry on for a year, 18 months, because I thought, she's young, she'll learn. And actually, I think that was an expensive error, both in terms of the performance of the company, but also probably in terms of how I was respected by other people within that leadership team, because I think it was visible to others as well. And so I would say, make sure it is a nettle before you grasp it. But when you're sure it's a nettle, grasp it and deal with it early.
That is very good indeed. Rings so true for me as well.
Well, we've all done it because we all try to be nice, decent people who are very fair to everybody. But sometimes you just have to get on with it.
Yeah, agreed. Brilliant. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation, Emma.
Well, thank you for asking such interesting questions.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks for listening to The Innovation Crowd. Subscribe on your favourite podcasting service so you don't miss a thing. And I'll see you next time.